that what this is? No.
Yes, the story is her partner's She's going to be 42.
I don't think it's that much.
Absolutely. You're running longer than Game of Thrones. Better outcome, too.
I don't know. He told me he was coming. I don't know where he is.
How's Nina's dad?
He's home. He's comfortable.
I talked to her 2 or 3 times while you were gone.
Thank you. You know, they're making do. It's not easy, but it's.
You had a good trip.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll say a word or two about it. Yeah, today's Chumash Day. Yeah. Good morning, Boker Tov. Good Shabbos. Wow, look at all you guys. Good Shabbos. Welcome. Happy Labor Day. Nice to see you all. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for coming back. Rabbi says, I'm going away for the summer. You don't know if there'll be Jews when he gets back. So it's a machaya. So thank you. And all of you watching on television all around the world, everywhere I went in the world, people say, I watch you on television. So who knew, you know? Who knew? It's really, really very nice to be back. Shabbat Shalom and welcome back. Today is actually part of Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Elul. So it's a very good time to gather up all your sins, the ones you're proud of and the ones you're not so proud of, and start preparing for the Chagim that are coming in about a month. Yeah, we're going to need books today. If you are a member of Valley Best Shalom, you should have already received connection with us, and you'll soon receive all the high holiday materials. That's a month from now. If you're not a member of VBS, member of someplace else, make sure your shul knows you're alive. And they'll send you tickets for the holidays. If you're not a member of any place else, we'd love to have you here. We put on all the holidays. All the holidays. Soup to nuts. We'd love to have you come. Just call the office. Tell them, I am so inspired by Rabbi Feinstein. I would like to come and pray with you for the holidays. So come and join us. Slichot, let's see. We're going to have Torah study every Shabbos from here on till the end of the springtime, and then we'll take another break. Shabbos mornings. Lunch and Learn, Wednesday, Lunch and Learn, and Thursday begins this week. So those of you around want to have lunch, we're learning. We're going to learn early prophets. We're going to do King David, David Melech Yisrael. So if you'd like to come and learn with us during the week, it's at 12. You bring your lunch at 12. We learn from 12:30 to 1:30 on Wednesday. Love to come. And there's a group of guys that do it on Thursday as well. Slichot is in 2 weeks, or there's a couple of other things too, but Slichot is coming at Saturday night. It's not the week right before the holiday, because the holiday's on a Sunday night. It's the week before that. And this year, the topic is going to be, Rabbi Farkas, my colleague, was invited by the German government, the Foreign Ministry of Germany, to accompany a group of Jewish leaders on a brief educational tour of Germany, and was very, very touched by the efforts of the German culture and community to remember the Holocaust and learn from it. So the question we're going to ask is, can we ever forgive? Can Jews and Germans ever make peace with each other? And we'll have, there'll be a film, there's a wonderful film about an Israeli couple that moves to Germany and how that plays in their family. And then Rabbi Farkas will be joined by Dr. Richard Campbell, who is a former member of the staff of the United States Embassy in Berlin and an archivist who gathered up all the records of German culture, and a wonderful teacher. And the two of them will have a conversation about what Germany has done to remember. That'll be Slichot night, and then we'll have the Slichot service, and Cantor Barron has incorporated music from the German Jewish community. So look in the Shabbaton, it has all the dates in there for that too. You know, off the top of my head, I don't know. I'm still in August, and I'm told that it's almost September. So, but it's the 15th. In the Shabbaton, yeah, I think it's the 14th. The Shabbaton has all the dates. Okay? All right, everybody well? Ever have a good summertime? We had an exquisite summertime. So Nina and I did some traveling together, which was beautiful. Went to Italy and Croatia. We spent some days in Dubrovnik. The reason you know Dubrovnik, if you watch Game of Thrones, Dubrovnik is King's Landing. All the scenes were filmed in that city. And if you watch Game of Thrones, because the tourist season's only half the year, everybody in Dubrovnik was an extra in Game of Thrones. So every cab you get into, every waiter at the restaurant hears you speaking English. Our tour guide says, "You're American?" "Yes." "Oh, season 5, I am guard. Season 3, I am peasant. I am friends with Cersei." And they all have pictures on their phones of them with the characters, with the actors. "And I went to cast party, season 4. Nice party." Right? So everybody, every tour guide, because they all played all the parts, and there was. It's very pretty. Yeah, it's very pretty. And then we're remodeling our home, so if you see my wife and she looks frazzled, that's why. And a few other nice things. My book is coming out in February, March. It's the biography of Rabbi Schulweis. So I've been working on that all summer as well. Anyway, welcome back. It's great to have all of you back. Shabbat Shalom. It's really wonderful. I hope you're all well, healthy and well. And ready. Yeah, on the 13th, Friday night, we're going to have a Rimonim service dinner. We're going to install the leadership of the congregation, talk about our goals for the new year. So that's also nice. Okay, we have missed the beginning of Dvarim. I'm sorry, that Parsha discussion is. I know. Well, there's no break for Torah. That's the thing. Parsha discussion is 12:30 in the Zicklin Lieberman Youth Lounge. Okay, we're going to go back to the beginning of Dvarim. Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Hebrew Bible, the 5th book of the Torah. It is an independent literary unit. It has its own literary style, its own ideas, its own way of looking at the world. It is presented to us as if it were Moses' last speech, his last oration, his bequest to his people. But it is really a very separate kind of book. It's a very interesting and very separate kind of book. So let's sort of catch up with this book, because it is remarkable. Remember James Michener, the great novelist? Remember James Michener? He writes these enormous books about places and cultures and things that he's discovered in the world. The first one was South Pacific, because he was stationed there in the war. And he wrote a book about Israel called The Source. Remember that book? If you don't have it, be careful not to drop it on your foot, because it's 1,135 pages long. It's a great book for a cruise, by the way. If you ever go on a cruise, it's a terrific book, It's a huge book, and what it is the way he structures the book is he takes a city in Israel. The real city is called Megiddo, and the city in the novel is called Makor, which means the source. And he goes through the archaeological levels of the source, of the city, starting with pre-biblical times, through biblical times, through medieval, modern times, and then brings you up to date. And the leitmotif is a conversation between two archaeologists, an American and an Israeli archaeologist, who are excavating the city. And at one point, the Israeli says to the American, you're not Jewish, he says, so you need to understand us, Jews. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to read the book of Deuteronomy. He said, first read it in English, and then if you're capable, read it in Hebrew, because that book will capture who we are. And I want to suggest you think about this. It's not a long book, by the way. It's 30 chapters. It's not a long book. You can skip the poetic parts because they're hard to read. Take the book and read it as if it were a book, because unlike many of the other sections of the Torah, this one can actually be read as a literary unit. And as you read it, you ask yourself, try not to take it for granted. I mean, the enemy of good Bible reading is familiarity, right? You say, oh, I know what he's going to say. Don't do that. Ask yourself, why is he saying this? Who is he saying it to? What is underneath, what is the motivation for saying this? It's a very interesting snapshot of the Jewish soul. A very interesting snapshot of the Jewish soul. In the text itself, this is Moses' last oration. Okay? It begins on page 981. Got 981? Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'evar Yarden mimidbar avras mul suf ben Paran uben Tofel leven Chatzerot v'dizav. These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, through the wilderness in the Arava near Suf between Paran and Tofel, Laban Chatzerot. He gives you the space, the place, and he gives you the moment, which is the way prophetic books begin. Prophetic books, with one exception, begin by saying, these are the words of so-and-so in the rule of this king, or these kings, in this place. No other Torah book begins that way. This begins more like a prophetic book. The second strange thing about that, Eila hadvarim asher dibar Moshe, is that when Moshe stood at the burning bush, and God recruited him for the mission of saving the Jewish people from Egypt, remember, Moses refuses 5 times. And one of the times he says to God, Lo ish devarim anochi. Lo ish devarim. I am not a man of devarim. Devarim means words, ideas. I'm not a man of words. Kvad peh ani. Now, kvad peh could mean heavy of mouth. It could mean he had some sort of speech impediment or defect. It could mean a moral defect. I'm not a public man. I talk to sheep. Me and sheep, we're like this, you know. Jews, not so much. You know, I'm not a man of ideas. I'm not a man of big visions. I've turned myself into private man. Lo ish dvarim anochi. Now, this is exactly 40 years later. 40 years later, the man stands in front of all of his people and he says, Ve'ele dvarim, ele dvarim. These are the dvarim that Moshe spoke. How does a man gain dvarim? This is a very interesting question. Think of who you were at, well, you could, if some of you are these ages, he's 120, but that's a little exaggerated. Think of who you were at 20. And then think of who you were 40 years later at 60. And what did you learn? What happened to you in the course of that 40-year journey, and what did it teach you? Think of who you were 40 years ago. Think of all the things you wish you knew 40 years ago that you know now. What happens to a human being in the journey of adulthood that gives us something to say? Many of us at the age of 20 or 30 had very little to say to the world, but when we get older, we have things to say. Problem is that nobody wants to hear us anymore. Some of us, by the way, it's the other way around. Some of us at the age of 20 knew everything. You know? We knew everything. We knew exactly how the world should change. We knew exactly what needed to be done. We knew everything at 20. By the time you get to 60, you say, you know what? I'm a little more modest now. What is the journey of adulthood? How much of it is success? How much of it is failure? How much of it is our relationships we entered into? It's an interesting Rosh Hashanah thought, to look back 40 years in your existence and ask you where you were 40 years ago Rosh Hashanah, where you were sitting in shul 40 years Rosh Hashanah, what your life was like at that moment, what you knew and what you didn't know, and what you wish you'd known, and what you know now, and what taught it to you. This is the internal story of Moshe here in this book. That literary motif, Moses talking to his people shortly before his death. I'm going to give you a preview of coming attractions. If you don't want to hear a spoiler, close your ears. He dies at the end of the book. Oh, why'd you tell us, Rabbi? I'm sorry. He knows he's going to die. He knows his time is up. He's lost Miriam, his sister. He's lost Aaron, his brother. God told him he's not going into the land. He knows this is his last stand. It's his last moments in the world. He gathers his children together, much like Jacob did at the end of Genesis. He gathers his children together, and he tells them the truth that God has taught him, that life has taught him. And that's what this book is. The pathos of the book is anxiety. There's a deep anxiety in this book. You'll hear it over and over again. There is a grammatical form in Hebrew called tzivui, which means command form. In contemporary Hebrew, we use it very rarely. If I want to tell you, read the book, I usually use second person future tense, tikrat sefer, right? Telech lamitbach, go to the kitchen. If you want to say to your kid, go to the kitchen and get me a sandwich, you say, Telech lemitbach v'tikach li a sandwich. You know, you use second person future tense, right? But kach means take, because it's considered in contemporary Hebrew somewhat impolite to use that. Like stop signs in Hebrew say, atzor, stop. They don't say vakasha ta'atzor, you know. Right? What? Yeah, you don't say vakasha at all. That's how you know it's an American. Right. I was sitting at the kibbutz table, and I'd learned at Camp Ramah that the way that you get something at the table is vakasha, not lavor li et melech, you know, pass me the salt. And this kibbutznik in his overalls, and he's like, you know, it's like, what kind of creep are you? It's like speaking Shakespearean English. It's the exact equivalent of saying, perchance, albeit you would send me the salt. And this kibbutznik said, actually, the guy looked at me and in perfect Brooklyn English said, you want the salt, kid? Come and get it yourself. I said, you speak English? He said, yeah, since I was in the Marine Corps, you know. Yeah, it was this, you know, long story. But this book uses the tzivui form frequently. For example, the Lord God speaketh to us, you know. Yeah, it's a message, right? You all know one of them, Shema Yisrael. It says that frequently. By the way, the Shema Yisrael that you all know, Shema Yisrael, it's only one of a dozen times in the book when that word is used. Because it's an opening of an oration. You know, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear. Shema Yisrael. Listen up, Jews. Today's Torah portion begins with the word re'eh. Look. See. There's an anxiety to this. In the literary structure of the book, Moses is about to die. He remembers that the last time he left this people alone without his leadership, they built a golden calf. He's terrified that they're going to do this again. What do you say at the end? When I've taught this book to people, I wrote this in an article for the paper. To me, this is the speech at the dormitory door. Right? When you take your kid, if you have an 18-year-old, God help you. When you have an 18-year-old and you bring the kid to college, you'll soon have this. And you drive her up to Berkeley, or you drive him to San Diego, you know, or you fly across the country to Yale or Oberlin or Indiana or Michigan. And you get to the dorm room and you carry the bags upstairs and you make the kid's bed and you put his underpants and socks in the drawer and you put his computer on the table. And then it's all done. And the kid says, well, Mom and Dad, I got to go to my dorm meeting. And you realize that, 18 years of child rearing and it's done. He's never coming back. She's never coming back to my home in the same way. She's always my kid. She's going to ask for money. But she's never coming back to my home and to my domain in the same way. What do I need to tell her? What do I need to tell him? And there's this palpable moment of sheer terror and anxiety. What if I forgot to tell you? What did I forget to teach you? So you give the kid $50 and you say, please don't do anything stupid and call me Friday and make sure you call your mother Shabbos. And, and there's this sense of, and that's what's here. That's what Moses is at the dormitory door. This geographic description on the beginning here, this is the entry point to Eretz Yisrael. What do I need to tell you? One last time, please. And you'll hear, if you do read the whole book, in some places he's begging. In some places he's commanding. In some places, and it's interesting to sort of make a chart of the different motivations. In some places he says, look, this is really good for you. In other places he says, if you don't do this, really bad stuff's going to happen to you. He threatens them. He begs them. He cajoles them. He insults them. He praises them. He flatters them. And you get the sense that, and by the very end, he's sort of exhausted. And at the very end, there's a really interesting, we'll get to it in a minute, but at the very end, there's a really interesting little statement in which she says, all this stuff I've taught you, it's not too hard for you. You feel the man's exhaustion. He's 120 and he's exhausted. It's not too hard for you. It's not far away. It's not on top of a mountain. It's not beyond the sea. It doesn't take a religious, spiritual virtuoso to do what I've taught you. It's in you. It's It's in your mouth and in your heart to do it. It's part of you. It's part of you. And you feel the man's exhaustion at the end when he says that to them. But the whole book, he's just trying so hard to say, like, please, do what I told you to do. Be what I told you to be. You have it in you. It's a beautiful pathos. Yes, please, John. Douglas.
If you were a professor of biblical criticism at a major institution,
Yes, I'm about
who would you tell was the author of this?
I'm about to get to that. We'll get to that in a second. That's my next question. Let me just get one more thing about pathos, okay, about feeling, the feeling tone of the book. It's a book about transition. We have been a people of the desert for 40 years. We have been desert nomads, Bedouins. We are about to become a settled people. Our economy is going to shift radically when we make the transition from the nomadic raising of flocks to settled agriculture. We're going to move from living in tents to living in buildings, living in huts, and then living in palaces, right? We're going to move, many of us will move from living in the wilderness to living in cities, towns, villages, urban areas, right? We're going to be, we were living in a domain in which we had no neighbors. I mean, you ever drive out like on the way to Vegas and you drive through these desert areas and you see out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, one mobile home, one trailer, one house. And you wonder, like, why would anybody want to live there? I can tell you why they want to live there, There's nobody next door with a big barking dog at 5 o'clock in the morning, No neighbors. Now, you can say things and do things and think things and imagine yourself in the world very differently if you have no one around who contradicts you. When we move into the land, we are one of many tribes inhabiting this land with many cultures, with many ways of doing things. Your kid's going to have to go to Canaan High School. And on Friday night, she's going to want to go to McCannon's restaurant to have hamburgers with her Canaanite boyfriend, and your son's going to date, Canaanite girls who are tall and willowy, and and they're going to want to bring. You understand this? I mean, that didn't exist in the desert. That's what living in the land means. So there is this in the literary structure of the book itself. Over and over again, he says, you're about to enter the land. Here's what you got to know. Here's what you got to know. The transition is radical and frightening, and terribly frightening. Now, Douglas's question. Who wrote this book? Well, if you'd ask an Orthodox rabbi, God. Well, not really God. Moses wrote it, but everything Moses writes is what God tells him to write. So that problem solved, okay? Critical thinkers imagine that the Torah as we have it is put together from different literary strata and literary documents. The book of Deuteronomy is its own literary document. It is a self-contained. There are little teeny fragments of Deuteronomy elsewhere in the Torah, but little teeny ones. The book of Deuteronomy pretty much is the whole document. In fact, the book of, and so it's called D in biblical criticism. Now the question is, who wrote D? Who wrote it? Whose point of view does it represent? Michael, do you want to add something? Please.
This relates directly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This relates directly to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Every author, and especially in Deuteronomy, because there appears to be perhaps a singular author for Deuteronomy. We're not sure, but stylistically,
It's very consistent.
it's consistent
It's very
with
even.
Jeremiah.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that. Go ahead.
It's very consistent with Jeremiah. And he may have written it. We don't, because nobody really knows.
Yeah.
But when we get to that section that you just pointed out in the latter part of Deuteronomy,
Yes.
after it gives all these commands,
Yeah.
it seems to me that's not, I don't see that, I see that as the author's bias, or
Yeah.
the author's moral imperative
Yeah.
to make an absolute revolutionary statement.
Yes.
Because that's a revolution. He goes through this whole thing and says, God's going to do this and God's going to do that. And yet, in that moment, he says, wait a minute. In order to understand this, you have to look into your own heart.
Right.
That is almost a Reconstructionist viewpoint.
In this synagogue, you're calling it Reconstructionist? I will tell you that verse of the Bible, it's Deuteronomy 30, 11 through 15. That's the epigraph of my biography of Rabbi Schulweis. That's his whole career in one verse, in two verses. All right, so let's come back to Michael's point. So we have this document called D. Okay? Who wrote D? Whose point of view does it represent? First of all, what you do need to know in the course of the Bible, two things. One is what Michael said, was that it bears literary parallel, literary similarity to the book of Jeremiah. Now the question is, and this is going to be a little complicated, but just because the book is called Jeremiah doesn't mean that it was written by Jeremiah. It might be the book about Jeremiah. We know from the book of Jeremiah, which is the book of the prophets, okay? There are several prophets that come next, that Jeremiah had a guy named Baruch, who was his ghostwriter, right? Or it says his scribe, his scribe. So it could be that Baruch wrote all this stuff. Baruch collected all of Jeremiah's sayings and wrote this history book to go along with it. If you read the next sections of and those of you in the Lunch and Learn on Wednesdays or Thursdays, we're going to do this together. Deuteronomy is actually the beginning of a whole section of books that tell the story of Israel's settlement in the land. From the last days of the wandering in the desert to the conquest of the land, that's the book of Joshua, to the hundreds of years before a king was appointed, that's the book of Judges, to the appointment of the first king Saul, and then the career and triumph of King David, Melech David, to his son Solomon, and then from Solomon, the successors in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in the book of Kings, First Kings and Second Kings, and it ends with the destruction of the southern kingdom at the end of the book of Second Kings. The theology, the central religious idea of all of those books is Deuteronomy. It'll say, so-and-so was the king of Israel. He ruled for so many years. Either he did what was right in the eyes of God, or he did what was wrong in the eyes of God. Now, Deuteronomy would really like to say that he did things that were bad in the eyes of God, and he only lasted 8 months in office, right? And he was either killed or he dropped dead of a heart attack. The problem is that it has kings like Ahab and Jeroboam, who were really rotten kings in the eyes of Deuteronomy, and they ruled for 55 years. So there's a sort of retelling of the history and a sort of covering, it's a sort of spin doctoring, we'd call it, about why it doesn't quite fit the theological model. The worst king of Israel was Ahab, and he ruled for a very long time, and he was very prosperous and very successful, right? The greatest king you've seen is Josiah, and he got killed young. So Deuteronomy is the theological framework of all the books of early prophets that follow. That makes some sense? Now, who wrote Deuteronomy? Right? Traditional Jews say Moses wrote the whole thing inspired by God. Modern scholars say there is actually some literary evidence of who wrote it. And here's the story, okay? So if you have history, you figure at the end of the Exodus from Egypt takes place somewhere around 1200, more or less. And we are now at around 12. If you advance history about 300 years, you get to a king named Josiah. Josiah is a king in Jerusalem. The kingdom has split. There are two Jewish kingdoms in the world. The northern kingdom, which is capitaled in Samaria, and the southern kingdom, which is capitaled in Jerusalem. You have a king named Josiah. Sorry, what? 624. He dies in 640. It's going to be earlier than that, 660. Anyway, all right. He dies in the middle of the 600 BCE, okay? And you have this king named Josiah, and his father dies very young, and he becomes the king as a kid. He's 8 years old when he becomes king as a regent until he reaches his majority. So he's taught by the priests of Jerusalem, and he becomes their disciple. As he becomes king, the temple of Jerusalem has been collecting a building fund. So those of you who are in the shul who have to pay a building fund, don't be angry. We've been doing this for thousands of years. Here's the good news. The building fund at Valley Beth Shalom is used to take care of the building. You can know that for sure. The building fund in the Temple of Jerusalem up to Josiah was siphoned off by the priests. Right? Priests would do such a thing? Well, you know. In those days it was before you had, TMZ and All these ways of finding you doing horrible things. Yeah. So Josiah comes, and the first thing he commands is that the temple building fund be kept for the temple building. And he looks at the temple building, and the temple building's really shabby. So he says, take the monies we've collected and fix it up. So they begin a massive remodel of the Beit HaMikdash. And during the remodel of Beit HaMikdash, I brought you the text so you could read it, because I know that not many of you have the book of 2 Kings with you, right? Right? He did, in the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent these guys, go to the priest Hilkiah and let him weigh the silver that's been deposited, right? And let it be delivered to the overseers of work who are in charge at the house of the Lord. Okay? Then the priest Hilkiah, so while they're doing the remodel, the king gets the following message from the high priest. Listen carefully. I have found a scroll of the teaching of the Torah in the house of the Lord. Right, we were doing some remodel, and when we pulled a wall out, we found a scroll right there behind the wall. And Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, he's the scribe, to read it. And the scribe went to the king, and he reported to the king, your servants have melted down the silver deposit in the house, they've delivered it to the overseers. The scribe told the king, the priest Hilkiah had given me a scroll. When the king heard the words of the scroll, he tore his clothes. He tore his clothes. And the king gave orders to the priest Hilkiah and a bunch of other guys, go inquire of the Lord on my behalf, on behalf of the people, on behalf of all of Judah, concerning the words of the scroll, for indeed great must be the wrath of God, who's angry with us, because our fathers did not obey the words of this scroll. Now, how do you authenticate a holy text? Right? Today you'd have a congressional hearing, you'd send Mueller to go figure it out, right? How do you give it to the FBI? So they bring it to a prophetess. There's a woman prophet in Jerusalem named Huldah. Okay? And they bring it to Huldah, and Huldah says, thus said the Lord God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, thus says the Lord, I am going to bring disaster on this place in accordance with the words of the scroll, because you've forsaken me and my wrath is kindled against you. And so Huldah says, yeah, it's authentic and you're in big trouble. Okay, so what happens then is that Josiah carries out a campaign to purify the religion of Israel. He begins by purifying the temple of all of the corruption and the idolatry that has grown up around it. Then he goes into the countryside. Now here's the idea, and here's why many scholars believe this is Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy has an idea that no other book of the Bible has. You can only sacrifice to God in one place, in the Temple of Jerusalem. Everywhere else in the Torah, wherever people want to offer sacrifice, they offer sacrifice. You remember when Jacob has his dream when he's on the way to see his father, to meet his wife, ultimately, to his uncle. He wakes up from the dream and he offers a sacrifice. Abraham offers sacrifices. People offered sacrifices in their backyard. If you were a rich person, you lived in a nice house in Encino, right? You had a priest who was on call. You want to offer a sacrifice. You did it in your yard. The book of Deuteronomy says, no. You can only do sacrifices in Jerusalem. So what Josiah does is he goes and destroys all the bamot, all of the local altars, and centralizes sacrifice in Jerusalem. At the same time, because this, and the other reason for doing that wasn't just that the book told him to do it, it's because local altars became syncretinous. They would be altars to many gods. There'd be altars to, I mean, it was a one-stop religion shop, right? Why have an altar just to Adonai? Why have an altar that's Adonai and Baal and Asherah? Pick your god. So when you show up, it's sort of a religious service center, right? Right? We fix all cars, you know. Jiffy Lube, Jiffy Sacrifice, Jiffy Corbin, right? You tell me which god you want to sacrifice to, no problem. In fact, if you're really smart, you split, you hedge your bet. Here's a sacrifice, Mr. Priest. Give 60% of it to Adonai, 20% of it to Baal, 20% of it to Osiris, and anything left you can keep. Right? I mean, why not? So this is why he goes on a campaign around the kingdom, destroying these sacrifice altars and centralizing worship in Jerusalem in order to centralize religious authority, in order to purify the religion of Israel. And the only book of the Torah that says to do that is Deuteronomy. So the regnant critical theory is that the book that was found in the temple on that day was the book of Deuteronomy. And by the way, if you're a little bit politically wise and savvy, you say, now hang on a minute, Rabbi. Let me get this straight. The king orders a remodel of the temple. Yeah. The remodel is being carried out under the supervision of the high priest of Jerusalem. Yeah. The book is found by the high priest of Jerusalem. Yeah. The book is authenticated by the high priest of Jerusalem. Yeah. And who has the most to gain from the teachings of this book, materially? The high priest of Jerusalem, because it means that everybody everywhere who wants to offer a sacrifice has to come and pay off. You cynical, skeptical people, you. This was a conspiracy of the priesthood, and the king bought into it for many reasons, by the way. Part of the reason the king bought into it is it coincided with his interests. If you want to keep a kingdom together, get everybody worshiping at the royal shrine. And the royal shrine, by the way, just incidentally, the Beit HaMikdash is directly across the street from the royal palace. So when you bring your sacrifice, you also have to pay your income taxes. And one more thing. At the moment Josiah introduces this reform, and this book is found and becomes part of the corpus of Israel's Torah, the same anxiety that we read in the book is gripping the kingdom, at least gripping the leadership of the kingdom. What's happening in the 7th century BCE? It's the rise of great empires. King David and King Solomon come in, please. King David and King Solomon were able to expand and enrich the kingdoms of Israel because the two great empires that lived in the neighborhood, Egypt and Mesopotamia, were in quiescence. They were not being active at the moment. They were very weak. But starting in the 7th century, starting during the time of Josiah, Egypt and Assyria, which is the first great northern Mesopotamian kingdom, are rising. Now, if you're a small kingdom and you're living in a neighborhood where there's no great empires, you can make some hay. You can do okay. But the thing that you're worried about most is what happens when those empires rise. When those empires rise, it changes the whole political landscape. The whole political landscape. Think today. If you were the president of a small country in the world today, would you align yourself with the United States? Would you align yourself with Europe? Would you align yourself with China? Where would you align yourself? Some of you, most of you, were part of the world I grew up with when there was First World, Second World, and Third World. Remember? There was our world, which was First World, with America, Canada, the UK, Europe, Western Europe, NATO, right? Then there was the Iron Curtain, and there was the Soviet Union, remember them? And all of their satellites. And then there were all these other countries called third world countries that played us off against each other, right? And the question, where would you align yourself? Well, if you're the king of Israel, do you align yourself with Mesopotamia against Egypt? Do you align yourself with Egypt against Mesopotamia? Do you try to stay independent of both of them? Do you try to create a union of small states to resist empire? How do you stay independent? That's number one. Number two, culturally, how do you preserve an independent culture? First of all, you have the rise of global culture, right? The Talmud is written in the language of Aramaic because the Babylonian Empire becomes powerful, and Aramaic is the language of Babylonia. How do you maintain your language? How do you maintain your culture? How do you maintain your cultural independence in a world when there's so many other cultures around, and particularly beginning of global cultures? We were in Croatia, a faraway country. Everybody speaks English. Everybody speaks English. Why does everybody speak English? Because the internet's in English. And everybody learns English from the internet. It's a funny English, but they learn English from the internet. Right? But how do you maintain your own? What if you're living in a smaller culture? How do you maintain your own language, your own ways, your own culture if your kids are going online? I mean, it's really very interesting to go to faraway places and see kids listening to American rock and roll music. Or worse, you hear local music which sounds in their language like our music. Hebrew hip hop. I mean, it's dreadful. It's dreadful. I mean, you know, it's dreadful, but it's Israeli kids wanting to be culturally, you know, timely, cool, right? By translating what is the cultural norm into their own kind of language. How do you maintain a cultural independence? How do you maintain a cultural independence? Again, I don't in any way, God forbid, justify this, but in some bizarre way, I understand 9/11. Why did they hit the World Trade Center? Because if you're a religious Muslim in Saudi Arabia and your daughter wants to dress like Britney Spears, you get pretty angry at the West. And you want to go after the guys who are corrupting your kids. If they wanted to destroy the American economy, they could have done it much better. 2 blocks over is the Federal Reserve Bank of Manhattan. If they'd flown the airplanes into that, we'd have been in real trouble. I mean, it was a horrible thing. I'm not saying that. And I don't justify this in any way. It was a horrible act of evil. But these guys, if they really wanted to destroy America, they could have done it in a much more efficient way. They didn't ask me, thank God.
Why do you think they didn't?
Because it was called the World Trade Center. And they said, that must be the place where they're sending Britney Spears clothing to my daughter.
I disagree with you.
Well, that's fine. Good. I'm glad.
You know, that the World Trade Center, and this was written by
Yeah, go ahead.
put together by the researchers at RAND
Yeah.
Corporation, and they said the obvious thing would have been to hit the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Why the World Trade Center?
I don't know.
Because what they're creating is not, we're going to destroy the economy. What we are creating is a theatrical
All right,
event.
that's also true. You're right. You're exactly right.
To
But you
scare the
see,
hell out of
but
everybody.
I'm not talking the cultural anxiety. Can I preserve my culture in a world of world culture? That cultural anxiety that those people experienced, that I maintain is part of, not all of, part of the motivation for this horrible act of evil, is present here too. They wrote it into this book. It's Moses trying to say, stay loyal. I know there'll be temptations. Stay loyal. That's what it's part of the anxiety of this book too, because it was part of the moment that Josiah was living in. All right, all that was by way of introduction. Welcome back from your summertime. It's nice to be together. Let's learn Deuteronomy. Any questions, comments, or counter sermons before we get started? Anything at all? Yeah, anything? I want to make sure. Okay, so let's begin. We can begin in many different places, but I want to begin with last week. So can you please turn to page 1048, which is chapter 10, verse 12. 1048. It's last week's Torah portion. So the structure of the book of Deuteronomy matches the structure of a covenantal treaty. I think it'd be better to try to close that door. I'm very sorry. You want to try to close the door, please? Is that okay? Just kick up that door stop. It'll be a little bit easier for us. Over this last 100 years, thank you so much. We have discovered, we have done a great deal of archaeology, 200 years. We've done a great deal of archaeology in the ancient Near East and discovered many, many documents that give us insight into how the Bible works. One of the most interesting is a set of documents that were found, well, there's several places, and we've discovered that contracts and treaties in the ancient Near East had a specific format. There's two kinds of treaties: treaties between equals, right, and treaties between unequals. Treaties between unequals are called suzerainty treaties. The suzerain is a king. Suzerainty treaties have a structure. In other words, already in the ancient Near East, among many, many different cultures, When you made a contract with somebody or you offered a treaty to somebody, there was a way to do it. Everybody recognized this format. The format is, it begins with a historical introduction. Here is our previous relationship. Then it says, here's what we're trying to do, a declaration of the purpose of the treaty. Then it has the stipulations of the treaty. One side agrees to this, one side agrees to this. Then it talks about how this treaty is to be recorded and remembered. Then it offers a set of blessings and curses. Blessings if you keep the treaty, what's going to happen if you break the treaty, and it ends with a prayer at the end. Deuteronomy fits it perfectly. Perfectly. The first 4 or 5 chapters of Deuteronomy are an historical introduction. Moses tells the people their history from the time they left Mount Sinai to the time they arrived in Eretz Yisrael. In the Torah's telling of the story, he's not talking to the people who were with him in Egypt. He's talking to their kids. Their question is, Moshe, it takes 2 weeks to get from Egypt to Canaan. Why did it take us 40 years? Where are our parents? And the answer is, let me tell you what happened on the way. That's the beginning of the book, historical introduction. Then for the next several chapters, there's the declaration of the purpose of this treaty. That's what we're about to read now. Then you have a whole bunch of stipulations. That's what the stuff that begins in today's Torah portion, which is called Re'eh, includes things like what meat you're allowed, what meats and animals you're allowed to eat and what animals you're not allowed to eat. How holidays are to be celebrated. All kinds of stipulations. And then there's a set of blessing and curses. There's a rubric for how you're going to remember this stuff. And it ends with a prayer to God. In other words, this is both a common document and a unique document. It's written in a literary form that would be instantly recognizable by any ancient Near Eastern. Because it's written in a form of every contract, every treaty was written in the same format. This book would be instantly recognizable. But here's the surprise. Nobody ever thought of making a treaty with God. Nobody ever thought of entering God into a contract. Only Jews had that chutzpah. Because what are you doing when you enter God into a contract? You're binding God. God says, okay, here's the deal. You do what you do, I'll do what I do. Who can bind God into a contract? I thought God was ultimately free to do whatever God wants. Answer is God is. And if God wants to enter into a contract and say, I will limit my sovereignty to the stipulations of this contract, God can do that. That's the remarkable idea here, that you can use a human literary form in order to interpret your religious experience. The section we're about to read is from that third section, from the second section. After the history, you have the declaration of the purposes of the contract. That's what this is. And I want you to hear all the pathos, all the feeling tone, as well as reading the ideas. Look at verse 12 in chapter 10. Right? Ve'ata Yisrael ma Adonai alecha shoel mimecha. Right? Oh, now Israel, what does God demand of you? What does God demand of you? What is the religious requirement? Right? Ki. You see the Hebrew word ki? Our translator uses only this. Right? Ki can mean all kinds of things in Hebrew. Because, that. He translates only this. Because it's an emphasis. Ki. Right? To revere the Lord your God and walk in his paths. To love him and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Keeping the Lord's commandments and laws which I enjoin upon you this day, which I enjoy upon you this day, which I enjoy upon you this day, what does it say? For your good. Now, what's the premise of this idea? You are free. You make choices. God will not affect your choices. God will not affect you. You have to make choices. I've made this little speech to kids every year. We begin day school this week, and I'm going to meet the kids on Wednesday morning for Minyan, and I'm going to tell them the following. According to what I read in paleontology, there have been dogs on Earth for 100 million years. 100 million years of pooches, of doggies. And yet, in 100 million years of doggies, no dog ever woke up in the morning and said meow. Not one. Not one. Can you imagine how many dogs there have been in the world? Not one dog ever woke up and said, today I'll be an octopus or a platypus. Today I'll be something that, because the day your doggie was born, her character was built in, instinctually, wired, we would say hardwired. Your doggie, first of all, knew everything there was to know about being a doggie on day one, and their character, you can teach a dog new tricks. Roll over, play dead, get me my slippers, please don't piss on the floor. For your own good. But your doggie is fundamentally a doggie. It's in there. Dogginess is in there. Dogginess is in there. You and me, human beings, we're very different. We wake up in the morning, and your character is an open book, a blank book. Your character is your own choice. You can be mean, you can be generous. You can be kind, you can be short-spirited. You can be patient, you can be abrupt. Right? Your character is your own choice. I mean, human nature is the uniqueness of, there are constitutional personality elements, right? Some of you are just nice people. Some of you are nice people. Some of us are nice people. You know, we have elements of our constitution, but fundamentally how we respond to the world, what we do, is open. It's a choice. Human nature is that kind of really interesting thing, which is it's an undetermined set. The Torah recognizes this. You make choices. Right? Kid always asks, if God knew that people were going to make such a mess of the world, why did God create people? What a great question. Isn't that a beautiful question for a kid to ask? And I always ask the kid, I have a facetious answer. I said, do me a favor, go home and ask your parents why they had you. Because they knew you would make a mess of their home. You know, you'd bring noise and schmutz into the house. Why did they have you? The kid came back and said, my dad said it had a bottle of Chardonnay. I said, Rabbi, what's Chardonnay? You know, I said, never mind. Look, you have choices to be made. God is not responsible for your choices. You're responsible. That's the whole premise of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, right? So the Torah says, look, I can't make you good. I can show you a way. I'll be with you. I can teach you a way to be in the world. But it's your choice. But however, you have to know that you live with the consequences of that choice. You live with the consequence. I say this to the kids all the time. The beginning of being a grown-up is learning that every choice you make carries consequences. That's intelligence. You can see what's coming next. Right? You and I, we have to make choices because we understand that there are consequences to these choices. Everybody wants to avoid the consequences of their choices. Look, that's why, you know, I love ice cream. I have never met an ice cream I couldn't love. I have such a love for ice cream, you know. There's a story about a lady that went to the doctor. The doctor said, I'm sorry, man, but you seem to be putting on weight. She says, doctor, I have a medical problem. I retain ice cream. You know, but I've learned over the course of my very, years of obesity that ice cream has consequences. It does. You just have to recognize that. There are consequences to our choices, right? If we behave in certain manner. Now, sometimes those consequences are direct. And sometimes those consequences are indirect. And sometimes the consequences are individual, and sometimes the consequences are collective, but they're always consequences. This is the fundamental philosophy of Deuteronomy. So what Moses is begging us and commanding us and cajoling us and threatening us is to recognize that we have this choice, that there is a way in front of you, but there's the iron law of consequences. That's what the book of Deuteronomy is. So he says, look, love God, revere God. Recognize that there is a God who lives among you and within you. Obey the ways of that God. It will go well for you. It's interesting. He doesn't say what you think he's going to say. He doesn't say here, do what God says because you owe God for what he did for you. That's coming. That was later. Or that's earlier and also later. He doesn't say, do it because God told you to do it. He says, do it because it's for your own good. But the problem is you can't see that right away. It's really hard to see right away. Look, the plate of fudge is right there. I don't know, have you ever had this experience? Cookies talk to you? Do cookies talk to you? Cookies talk to me. I'm a cookie whisperer, right? Come on, have one. Have a half one. What's it going to do? It's only half, you know. Then break that in half. It's only half, you know. You know, there's so many temptations, and he says, it's for your own good. Damn it. It's for your own good. That's what he's trying to get us to see. All right, we have some questions already. Yeah. One verse that we have questions. I'm proud of you guys. Please, and then we'll go back here. Yeah.
In that verse 12,
Yeah.
Kim le'ira. Ira means fear.
Yeah, but not here. Yirah doesn't mean fear like pachad. Pachad means I'm afraid of something, right? I'm afraid of spiders, right? I'm afraid of snakes. I'm afraid of things. People are afraid of stuff. Yirah here means something different. It's actually a very long lecture. Yirah means, in English we'd use the word reverence. Because it says you're supposed to yirah your father and mother. What does it mean to yirah your father and mother? Yeah, but elsewhere it says yirah.
Is it like all?
Yeah, it's revere, it respect, but to a higher degree. I'll tell you where yirah comes, where you find yirah, where the pattern of yirah is. Yirah, Rabbi Schulweis suggested to me. Rabbi Schulweis wrote a book on conscience. He was really interested in the phenomenon of conscience. Okay? He was looking for a word for conscience in Hebrew. The modern Hebrew word for conscience is matzpen, right? From matzpun, which comes from a couple of words. It can either be tzafon, right? Which is north. A matzpen is a compass. Your conscience is your compass because it leads you to the north. Your conscience is the force that leads you in the right direction. But the Bible doesn't have that word. The Bible uses the word yirah, right? And it's really interesting where it uses it, particularly in Genesis and Exodus. Wherever Jews meet non-Jews and want to know if there is common decency in this place, the word yirah is used. Abraham passes off his wife as his sister. When Avimelech, the king, finds out, he says to him, why the hell did you do this? And Avram Avinu says, Abraham says or is it Abraham or Isaac? He says to Isaac, he says to Abimelech, I didn't know that there was any yirah in this place. I didn't know if you guys observe a common universal rule of decency. Okay? Same thing, when Joseph is still pretending to be the vizier of Egypt and he takes his brother captive, he says to his brothers, don't worry, I'm a man of yirah. I'm a man who observes the law of decency. It's the way you feel it's the way you feel when you stand in front of a moral obligation. You feel obligated. You feel claimed. You feel impressed upon by a moral obligation. We use the word in English reverence, but that's a little bit more emotional than this is. You feel claimed. You feel obligated. Okay? I go to a supermarket and the clerk gives me too much change back. Do I give back the too much change? Or a restaurant? I give her back the change. I said, I'm sorry, I gave you a 10, not a 20. You know, so the person I'm with says to me, you're a schmuck. It would have been free. I said, no, you know, that's not right. That's yirah. It's not right. It wouldn't be right. I have an internal sense of right. So here the idea is, I stand before God with a sense of I'm claimed by God. That's the idea. I'm responsible to God. I think that's the better answer than pachad, which is, ooh, I'm afraid, which is actual palpable fear. Does that make some sense? Yes, please.
Okay. The contract really seems to be
Yeah.
between God and the Israelite.
Yes.
But it's really not. It's God chose the Israelite. They had nothing to say about it.
Well, you know, it's a contract. We entered it. At Mount Sinai, we entered into the contract. Moses said, do you want the contract? And we said, yeah, we will accept it. Na'aseh v'nishma. Right? Don't ever do this in real life, by the way. Na'aseh v'nishma. Don't agree to it before you read it. Okay? Right? But God offered. Now, you could say, some contract. God offers you a contract. You're going to say no? And there is, in fact, a rabbinic midrash to this extent, which says the people of Israel gathered Tachat Har Sinai, which literally means at the foot of Mount Sinai. But the rabbis take it even more literally. Tachat Har Sinai means underneath Mount Sinai. God picked up the mountain, held it over our heads, and say, "How'd you like a covenant?" Ooh, okay. So you're right. So the question is this really an act of free choice? Is this an act of free choice? Actually, in real life, you have this choice at every moment. I mean, that's what Moses is telling you. It's not that there's one Sinai moment when you say, "I accept the covenant." Every moment, you have this moment. I mean, think about a marriage. You renew a marriage every moment. You say, I still feel obligated to this person. I feel connected to them. I feel part of this family. It's something that has to be renewed at every moment of choice because you have the ultimate existential freedom to walk away at any minute, right? That's I think what's going on here. All right, let's keep going. Ready? We're on verse 15. Yet it was to your fathers that the Lord was drawn in his love for them, so he chose you, their lineal descendants from among all people. Cut away the thickening about your hearts. The literal reading is circumcise your heart. The idea is that there's this sort of callousness of human beings. Stop being so stubborn. Stop being so willful. Stop being so difficult. And stiffen your necks no more. For the Lord your God is supreme, great, mighty, awesome God, who shows no favor, takes no bribe, upholds the case of the fatherless and the widow, befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. What an interesting statement. You give this powerful introduction about loving God, and then what's the denouement? What's the moral conclusion of that? It could have said what? What could it have said? Worship God with all your heart, right? It could have said, join a shul and make a large contribution to the rabbi's fund. It could have said, it could have said a lot of things, right? It could have said a lot of things. What does it say? God, what's the one characteristic it tells you about God besides being awesome, mighty, and all that? What does God do? God worries about whom? Which humanity? You're exactly right. But whom in humanity?
The helpless.
God, is God worried about the billionaires on Fifth Avenue? I hope so. Someone should, right? The vulnerable. God took you out of slavery when you were vulnerable. You need to know this is God's way in the world. God takes care of the vulnerable. God takes care of the weak. God is watching the way you construct a society to see if you have learned anything from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Because if you go into Canaan and you build Egypt all over again, an oppressive class society in which human beings are turned into objects, God will have felt God failed. Isn't it remarkable? You too must befriend the stranger. It doesn't even say befriend the stranger. Look at the line. It's the last line of the paragraph. Ve'ahavtem. Before it said you have to love God. Now it says you have to love the stranger. Love the stranger. Embrace the stranger. Welcome the stranger. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. This is the experience you just came from. This is the moral denouement. Now, notice what's not here. I'll be right with you. Notice what's not here. The whole text is not about saving your soul. It's not about surviving death. It's not about salvation. You could write a very nice book. Somebody did. It's called the New Testament. About saving your soul and achieving salvation and living forever. That's not what it's about. What's the one stipulation here of the relationship that you have with God? God watches out for the vulnerable. When you build a society It has to be a society dedicated to watching out for the vulnerable. This is a remarkable statement. It's a very surprising statement. It's like, now wait a minute. God's powerful and mighty and great. Wouldn't God hang out on Fifth Avenue with the powerful and the great? Isn't that where you'd find God? God is glorious. You should be hanging out with glorious people. I was in Beverly Hills the other night. What a glorious place. Right? I mean, all these beautiful people shopping for beautiful things, wearing beautiful clothes. Right? I always feel so intimidated in those stores. I'm such a working class kid. Yeah, I walk into these stores, I just want to take a look. I said, Nina, let me just take a look. I walk in this store. It has a guy's name on the wall, Take a look at a shirt. I mean, a nice shirt, $895. And the gentleman comes over, lovely gentleman. He says, may I find your size? I said, not in a million years. But what's more is that guy, I shouldn't confess this, but I feel so intimidated, and the guy intimidates me. Because his job is to intimidate me, right? Because he is the embodiment of the ethos of this store, which is for a certain kind of shopper, a certain kind of gentleman, a certain kind of person, and he wants to know, like, what are you doing here, you with your sneakers? And it takes me a minute to wait a minute, you're a store clerk and I'm a professional. I probably make more than you do, but you're making me feel bad, just because I'm not willing to spend $900 on a lousy shirt. A nice shirt. Lovely shirt. Right? All my clothes in the world don't cost that much money. Like one shirt. When would you? I wouldn't wear it. I would be if I put it in a case in my living room. Show people, look, I own one of these. Can you imagine wearing it to a coffee shop and spilling coffee on it? I'd kill myself, right? How did he die? Well, he was at Jerry's Deli and they splashed coffee on his $895 shirt. So he took a fork and committed suicide. Got blood all over the shirt. And they'd hang it as the holy, the holy shroud or something. The holy shroud of Feinstein. If you want a prayer, you'd put. It's like. How did I get out of that? It's God. Where does God hang out? In the slums. Where does God hang out? God hangs out in it. God wants to know what you're doing about the slums. I mean, it's a remarkable statement. It's a remarkable statement. All right, there's a lot of comments in the back because I've now pissed everybody off. So let's get these comments in the back, and then I'm going to go get the people in the back because they're very anxious. So
We have two versions of
I'm sorry.
so-called
Yeah, go ahead, please.
so-called 400 years of slavery or 210.
Whatever. 200
Why
years.
is it so
Fine,
diverse?
200 years of slavery. That's fine. You're right.
Which one is, why 400?
We were in Egypt for 400 years. We were only enslaved for 280 years of that. Yes, please.
Rabbi, so we all know this is in the context of Judaism. But if
Well, yeah.
Okay. But what keeps me a Jew? Because this seems like a very universal way of
That's a
human
beautiful
living.
question. That is
How
such.
do
All
I
right,
make it particular for Jews?
That's a beautiful question. It raises a very interesting philosophical idea. If core moral values are fundamentally universal, and values are universal, what makes them Jewish values? I mean, what makes any of this Jewish, right? So we can look at this in many, many different ways, and I don't have the 2 hours it would take, but let's just answer it very, very quickly. If I want to teach you a core moral value, protect the vulnerable, how do I do that? Well, I can do it from a Platonic point of view. Plato said the good is available to all. If you know the good, you'll do the good. I'll tell you to contemplate on the nature of the universe, and you too will come to understand why this is an expression of the good in the world. The problem is with that people know the good, they don't always do the good, right? That's why Coca-Cola is still in business, right? Because all of us know this stuff isn't very good for us, but we drink it by the quart, right? I could tell you that it's your moral duty. That's Kantian ethics. But there, too, moral duty doesn't always have sway, especially in a world of mass media, which is constantly hypnotizing us to go in this way or that way. The expression of this ethic is rooted in what? In your personal experience. You were a slave in Egypt. And because you were a slave in Egypt, you remember the oppression, the humiliation, the brokenness. That way, when you walk the streets of Los Angeles and see a broken, humiliated person, first of all, you see them. Because contemporary culture teaches you not to see them altogether. You're supposed to drive right by them and not see them. They're supposed to be invisible to you, right? You're supposed to look up at the Getty Center, not down at the homeless, right? Now, but now you see them. Now, why do you see them? Right? Why do you see them? You see them because you carry a historical memory, which is part of your personal identity, of being that person. I see them and identify with them. I was him. I am him. And that's why he worries me. So the moral value itself, I think, is universal. The expression of that moral value has to be rooted in a particularist narrative that's rooted in our experience. Our Jewish experience gives context and motivation and inspiration for that particular value. Freedom is something that all human beings aspire to. Pesach is Jewish. Pesach is Jewish, right? Moral reflection and self-improvement is a value all morally sensitive human beings value. Yom Kippur is Jewish. You create a particularist context of a narrative, a ritual, a hero, a story, to express the value, to interpret the value. Now, there are Jewish versions of the value. There's a big difference, for example, between Christian charity and Jewish tzedakah. We interpret it differently because it comes from a different way of looking at the world. In Christian charity, you feel it with your heart and you give it to it. That's why caritas is from the core, from the heart. You feel the charity. Jewish tzedakah, you do whether you feel like it or not, because the guy's still hungry, right? It's still a mitzvah, even if you don't feel like doing it. The only mitzvah you have to feel like doing is davening, which I feel like doing, right? Because that mitzvah, there's nothing else except the speech act, and therefore it has to be done with a full heart. But every other mitzvah is done because you have an obligation to do it. So the value is universal, but the expression of that value, the core expression of that value is ours, is particular. That's how I interpret it. Now, other rabbis would tell you differently. They're wrong, but no, the other rabbis would tell you differently, and you're welcome to go and inquire. Bruce, you can get the last question today, because I got to go do a bar mitzvah in a minute. So, no, ask the question. Come on, you're here. I love you having you here. It's an honor.
I was just going to say that it's complicated because on the one hand,
yes,
right, you're saying God dwells among the people.
That's what it says.
And on the other hand, now we have a central structure, right, where you got to bring your sacrifice, and
yes,
you can only bring your sacrifice in that central structure.
Yes.
And at the same time, it's saying, by the way, when you bring your sacrifice to that central structure, there's certain things that you need to leave aside for the priests as you do that.
Yes.
So at the same time that it's talking about the widow and the orphan,
it's also
building up a structure which later down the road turns into a great deal of trouble.
Right. And the same guy who may have written this book, as Michael said, Jeremiah, becomes the most bitter critic of that central institution. Exactly right. But here's the interesting thing. Later on in the book, we'll get into the law of tithes, because you're all Jews and you love tax law. I know you, right? And in tax law, in tithes, there's a really interesting section of tithes, right? So every year you have to, different years you pay different tithes, different taxes. The third year of tithes goes to the poor of the community. So 1 year goes to the temple, 1 year goes to the Levites, and the third year goes to the poor, right? You're also supposed to bring the poor with you when you make pilgrimage to Jerusalem so that they share the feast of the celebration in Jerusalem. They built in anti-poverty measures into this law. Were they ever observed? That's a different question. But your impulse of, if you're building up a strong central institution, you're going to leave behind the folks in the community. That's a very, very astute observation. Welcome to Deuteronomy. If you have a little time this week, Takya, if you have a little time this week, seriously, open the book and read it. It reads really well. It's really interesting. Next week, we're going to jump right back into the middle of it and enjoy the sort of ethos of Deuteronomy. And next week, we begin our preparations for the high holidays. It's great to have you all back. Shabbat Shalom.
Is there such a thing as God's plan, and how does it relate to my choice?
Wait, Louise! Go.
Okay, before you leave, the religious committee would like you to know we are in need.